So, good evening, everybody. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm with Vermont Coverts, and welcome to our presentation tonight on understanding Vermont Conservation Design. We have with us tonight Carolyn Loeb. She's a graduate of the Field Naturalist program from University of Vermont, and she worked with Coverts and the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department on doing some research and understanding of interaction with landowners on Vermont conservation design. And we're really excited to bring this to you. It's a wonderful tool that Vermont has developed, but it does need a little explanation and understanding with it. So Carolyn's going to provide that for us tonight. I ask that you all mute yourselves so that we don't have any background noise. Carolyn does have an interactive portion prepared for us. And so we're going to ask you to use your raise your hand function, which is in the lower part of the chat box on the far right hand side. You can raise your hand. When we get to that portion, we'll let you know. And if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box that might be general questions. So we're really excited to have you on board. I'm going to turn this over to Carolyn, let her tell us a little bit about herself, and jump right into understanding Vermont conservation design.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you all so much for being here this evening. To give you a little background about myself, I am a trained naturalist, researcher, and educator, and I currently work for an international environmental nonprofit to promote sustainable forest management practices. And I moved to Vermont in 2017 to study field ecology at the University of Vermont through the Field Naturalist graduate program. And in 2018, as Lisa mentioned, as part of my master's degree, I was hired by Vermont Coverts and the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department in order, in part, to bring Vermont conservation design to Coverts cooperators. So this is a topic I have thought a lot about, and I hope I can provide you with some valuable information and maybe inspire you a little bit this evening to get involved and to start digging into land that you care about, or maybe a property that you own. So with that in mind, I have a few last housekeeping notes to add on to Lisa's. The first thing to note is that this presentation is a full hour, and it could potentially run over if we collectively get excited about the interactive portion of the presentation. So with that in mind, I will ask you to save your questions for the end of the presentation, or if you're afraid that you're going to forget them, to go ahead and type them into the chat box. I've also sent Lisa some resources that she'll be sharing with you after this presentation, including step-by-step instructions for how to use BioFinder. And this presentation is going to be recorded. And one of my hopes is that when you receive the link to the recorded presentation, if you can't remember everything we covered tonight, or if you want to go over BioFinder step-by-step and have me with you, then you can hit play and pause on the recording of this presentation, and you can use that to walk yourself through BioFinder one step at a time. So with that in mind, don't take too many notes unless you feel compelled to, and I invite you to sit back, relax, and just enjoy what I'm about to share, and I hope you find it useful. Lisa knows that I really like to start presentations with stories, and so tonight I'm going to start by sharing a story with you all that is a very important story for me, and I think additionally has some bearing on understanding Vermont conservation design. So that story is that ever since childhood, I have gone to Lake Superior Provincial Park with my family, and we have a tradition in our family that in the evening, we go down to the shore of Lake Superior, we bundle up, and we watch the sunset. And once the sun has set, we lay back on our blankets and we look up to some of the most glorious night skies I have ever seen. And as a child, I used to engage in a really interesting thought experiment lying there on the beach with my family at night, looking up the stars. And what I would do is I would pretend that for some reason, the gravitational forces of the earth no longer applied to me. And I would imagine that my body was slowly but surely lifting up and drifting off the face of the earth and into outer space. And in my imagination, as I would drift towards this vast, immense space and away from the earth, I would pivot my body and I would look back and I would see my family and the shores of Lake Superior and Ontario, North America, and the earth get smaller and smaller until they were almost gone. Now you might imagine what kind of parents did this girl have that this was the sort of thing she would do for fun on her summer vacation? But to be honest, I found this thought experiment really quite comforting, because by zooming all the way out, I was able to look back and to really truly understand how special and how unique the Earth is. And then by turning around mentally and zooming back in, I could start to see all of those magnificent details that were not necessarily viewable from outer space, but that make our home incredibly special at multiple scales. So I personally think that the major idea behind Vermont Conservation Design is a perspective shift, and the design allows us to zoom out to the 10,000-foot view, or zoom in to the smallest parcel you can imagine, and to discover what makes those places special or unique or connected to everything else. So with that in mind, during this presentation, what I really want to do is first introduce you to the design, not just through a story, but by walking you through the nitty-gritty of what it is. I'd like to then introduce you to BioFinder, which is the online tool for viewing the design, and that is the way you personally would access the design if you wanted to see something of interest. I'd like to then walk you through step-by-step how to look at a property using the design. And then finally, and what I hope will be a really fun part of this presentation, is to open it up for group discussion by giving you a challenge property and asking you to apply your skills regarding that property in Vermont Conservation Design. And really the overarching goal of this presentation is to help you feel comfortable using Vermont Conservation Design to zoom in and zoom out on your own land or any land that you care about, to help you answer questions like, what makes my land special and how is it connected to everything else? So let's start with the basic. What is Vermont Conservation Design? I like to think of Vermont Conservation Design as a vision that ensures the biological integrity of the state of Vermont and guarantees that Vermont will remain a great place for people, plants, animals, fungus, bacteria, you name it, to live even under climate change and additional land use changes. And what makes Vermont Conservation Design, in my opinion, even more special is that it is a spatially explicit design. So it's literally a map, and you can zoom in on that map and you can figure out which lands we're really looking to focus our emphasis on stewardship for. And Vermont Conservation Design is a very scientific design, which means that there's a large group of people who've spent years trying to figure out what is it we need to do to ensure a biologically functional future. And that vision is Vermont Conservation Design. So it's pretty cool. And Vermont Conservation Design is really great at zooming in and out, as I mentioned. So the first perspective that Vermont Conservation Design takes is thinking big. This zooms us out to 10,000 feet and says, okay, if we look at Vermont as though we are up in a satellite, what do we know about it? And which features are going to be really important to ensure biological integrity of the state into the future? So the first category of features that this 10,000-foot view looks for is interior forest blocks. And you can think of these as the big unbroken forests where animals like moose and black bear and hermit thrushes live. And these animals are forest animals. And not only are they forest animals, but they really need large unbroken tracts of forest in order to survive, move, and reproduce. The design also identifies something called connectivity blocks. And if you think of forest blocks as the biological towns of Vermont, the connectivity blocks are kind of like the forest highways that connect those towns together. And so animals can use connectivity blocks in order to move between these forest blocks, which help them survive and reproduce on the landscape. The design also identifies surface waters and riparian areas. And this is the network of ponds, lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands in Vermont that provides really important habitat for aquatic insects, amphibians, fish, and other animals, and also provides humans with really important services like flood control or water filtration. Riparian wildlife connectivity is an interesting one. So this design feature refers to the edges of water bodies and waterways that have forest cover and which animals preferentially use to move, especially in places like the Champlain Valley, where there may not be very much intact forest left. So if your connectivity blocks are like Interstate 89, then your your riparian wildlife connectivity is kind of like Main Street in your town. This is how animals are moving locally to get the resources they need without exposing themselves without the cover of the forest. And finally, physical landscape diversity in blocks refers to the combination of soil and bedrock. So you can think of that as the things below the ground that give rise to a diversity of life above ground. So for example, the soils of the Champlain Valley are going to give rise to very different plants and thereby animals and other species than the soils and the bedrock of the top of Mount Mansfield. You can kind of picture in your head, you'd be really surprised to see certain things on the top of Mount Mansfield that you'd see in the Champlain Valley and vice versa. And part of that reason is because the soils and the bedrock are very diverse. And so by conserving diverse soil and bedrock, we can then conserve the ability of those soils and bedrocks to give us a diversity of life in the future. But as I said, Vermont Conservation Design is all about perspective shifting. So it doesn't just think big, it also thinks medium and small. For example, it identifies features like wildlife road crossings where animals are preferentially thought to be crossing the road. It identifies vernal pools, which are important breeding grounds for insects and amphibians in the springtime. It also looks at aquatic habitats and wetlands in a more in-depth way than that 10,000-foot view can provide. And rare and uncommon plants and animals. And these are species that we already know are having a hard time in Vermont. And it may not just be climate change that's causing some of these species to have a hard time surviving. So we know that they need some special attention. And finally, rare and uncommon natural communities. And natural communities are a hard thing to define. But if I said to you, imagine New York City, you might conjure up an image of skyscrapers and on a normal day, busy streets, honking of horns, maybe a certain smell in the air, perhaps even the Statue of Liberty. And so if I said to you, think of a cattail marsh at dawn, you might think of a blue heron fishing, little fish darting through quiet water, cattails moving in the breeze. And so natural communities are not one particular species, but they're a group of species that really create a community and create a unique space, just as our human communities are also unique. So these are the small features of Vermont Conservation Design. And then there's a third target type, which is actually, I think, even in some ways, a bigger perspective shift. And that is long-term additional targets. And these are targets that move around on the landscape over time. And so it's really hard to put them on a map because they don't stay in one place. And this category includes things like young and old forest and grassland refuges. So if you have a grassland today, in 30 years, it's going to be a young forest, and in 200 years, it will be an old forest. And so the design looks at Vermont and says, where do we not have enough of these things, knowing that they're not going to stay in one place? And the overall goal of Vermont Conservation Design, as I said, is to create an ecologically functional future for the state of Vermont. And so it specifically says, if we cannot conserve or steward everything, because we know that people need places to live, we need food to grow, what is it that we should prioritize? And that's what this map is. And not only does it say these lands are important for an ecological future, but it considers climate change. And so it says, how are these lands connected together? And can species move up in elevation, or can they migrate if they need to? And so this little outset on the right shows you that if we can steward or conserve the lands shown here in green and dark blue, then we can also allow for a future in which animals may come from Massachusetts and they may migrate all the way to Canada, or they may come from the Adirondack Park and they may head from Vermont into northeastern New Hampshire. So to me, it's not just that the lands themselves are special, but Vermont Conservation Design really does a great job of saying, how is everything connected to everything else, which I think is a really amazing thing and very important when we consider the changes that are probably coming. So for an example, if I said to you, you know, I really think we should steward this forest, or we should consider conserving it, you might justifiably look at this and you might say, I don't know, Carolyn, it's a young forest. It's got a lot of maple trees. I mean, it's beautiful, but most of Vermont has maple and much of Vermont is beautiful in the fall. And we have a lot of forests of this particular age. But maybe I could convince you that this forest is especially worthy of your attention if I told you that it was here, right along the north-south connector of the Green Mountains. which eventually will allow animals to migrate all the way through the state of Vermont along the spine of the Green Mountains. And if I pull that star away, you can see that that connection is extremely thin. And so this forest that may not look special on the ground, when we zoom out and we undergo that perspective shift, becomes an extremely important place. Here's another example. If I said to you, do you want to donate some money to really work on protecting this space, or maybe applying some stewardship to it, you might justifiably look at this and say, there's a road, there's a bunch of houses, I see a bridge in the distance. What's so special about this place? There are other places that look a little bit better. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you, except if I told you that that space was right here, and that it connected the waterways of Lake Champlain to the Champlain Hills, and from there to the Green Mountains, and knowing that animals are preferentially moving along waterways and water bodies when the forest is fragmented, as it is in the Champlain Valley, maybe then I could convince you that this parcel really was worth your focus, even though there are many deserving candidates. So with that in mind, that's a very brief overview of what Vermont Conservation Design is. And if you're still a little bit confused about it, don't worry. I'm hoping that as I walk you through the online mapping tool for Vermont Conservation Design, I will be touching on all of these layers again, and that it will sort of help to reinforce why you might think about these layers and what you might do with that information. So for this portion of the presentation, I'm literally just going to take you step by step through the BioFinder website. I'm going to plug in this example property, 308 Adams Road in Chester, Vermont, which I have never been to. And I'm going to show you how I might think out loud about that property if I were using it on BioFinder as the property owner, or as someone who cared about that property and wanted to apply Vermont Conservation Design to my management activities. So if you were going to do this, the first thing you would do would be to go to the BioFinder website, which you can get at this address, or if it's too long to remember, you can just go to Google, type in Vermont BioFinder, and this website will pop up. And then down here, you're just going to click on the BioFinder map, and it will take you into this portal. So there are multiple ways to search and to find in BioFinder. I'm just going to show you one way tonight. So what I've done is I've typed in the address, 308 Adams Road in Chester, Vermont. And if I click on the little magnifying glass, it will actually pop up with an address match. And if that address looks right, what I will do is I'll click on it, and it will zoom me into my area of interest. And of course, at this point, I can look and I can say, yeah, that looks right, or no way, that's not where I want to be. And I can type in a different address, or I can actually plus or minus zoom in and out on the map. So once I'm zoomed into my address of interest, the first thing that I personally like to do is I like to toggle left to the layers right here, and you'll see some things that start to look familiar: Vermont Conservation Design landscape and community layers. And there's an awful lot checked on the left side of the screen. So the first thing I like to do is I like to turn off or collapse any layer that I do not want to see. I like to leave on this layer and our base map data because that shows me the general boundaries of this property. And I also like to leave on the orthophotos layer because that shows me a satellite image. And from this particular stance, you can already start to interpret some things about this property we were looking at. So it looks like the landowner has their house on the south side of the property. They have some sort of field directly around the house, and then most of the property is forest land. So that's great information to start with. So now we can start to zoom out to that 10,000 foot view. And on BioFinder, you will see this layer called Overall Priorities for Vermont Conservation Design. And if I turn on the landscape scale for that, and then I click on the parcel, you will see that this parcel is giving me an overview of how it fits into Vermont Conservation Design at that 10,000 foot view. And in particular, it's saying that this property is a highest priority connectivity block. So remember, those are the I-89 forest highways. It's also a physical landscape diversity block. Those are the soils and bedrock, or the things below ground that are special and give rise to things above ground. And it's also a priority interior forest block. And that means that it's not maybe the first priority of the design, but it's an important interior forest block for forest animals like moose, black bears, and hermit thrush to live. You can then zoom in or drill down. So we're not necessarily getting closer, but we are getting more specific into this layer. So if I turn on landscape components, and then I check the box that says surface waters and riparian areas, I can immediately see that this landowner has a stream running through their property. So at this point, if I were this landowner and I were going to start thinking about how I might incorporate the design into my management systems, I might actually go out and walk that stream. And I might say, you know, this is a highest priority target. That means it's really important for keeping Vermont a good place for everyone to live in the future. What can I do as a landowner on my property to ensure that that stream remains in good condition? So for example, at the point where that stream crosses the field, I might actually plant some trees, because we know that if there's not a lot of forest cover, the water temperature of streams heats up. I might also look for signs of erosion, and I might start to think about some of the things that I might be able to do as a landowner to minimize that. For example, planting more natural buffers along my stream so that things don't filter into the water, and so that the water slows down as it enters the stream. Or I might even consider putting some coarse woody debris in my stream if I have control over it to slow down the flow of water. The next layer we're going to look at or drill down into under landscape components is interior forest blocks. So there's a couple of things to think about as a landowner with this layer. The first is that you can immediately see that this particular property owner doesn't own all of the intact forest block, as is probably obvious. They own a small portion of it. And so if I were this landowner and I really wanted to see moose or black bear on my property, you know, it might not just be up to me as to whether those things were there. So for example, if all of my neighbors decided to develop or subdivide their properties, it's pretty unlikely that I would see a lot of moose or black bear moving through my property, because the forest around it would become fragmented. On the other hand, if everyone in my neighborhood is really excited about wildlife and we could keep this forest block intact, our collective chances of seeing those animals is fairly high. We're going to drill now into connectivity blocks. So again, you just click on landscape components and connectivity blocks. And when you look at this, you'll see that it actually looks quite similar to the interior forest blocks that I just showed you. And that's not a mistake, because oftentimes things are tagged in multiple ways. And so this is tagged both as a connectivity block and as a priority interior forest block. So just like from the interior forest block perspective, if I'm the landowner and I want to promote movement of wildlife on my property, there are things I can individually do, but overall, the value of that connectivity is going to depend on my neighborhood as a whole and not just my actions as a landowner. Conversely, if I, as the landowner, decided to put a house way at the back of the property, I might actually severely inhibit movement of a lot of wildlife through my region, because most animals are very hesitant to go through developed areas. So although we haven't necessarily, as private landowners or as private citizens working with properties, we don't have all the influence. We certainly do have a lot of influence on how things live and move on our landscapes. You'll also notice that by clicking on the yellow shape on the screen, I've pulled up this box, which gives me a little bit more detail about why this is a highest priority connectivity blocks, how big it is, and what the priority it is for the state. So on a scale of 1 to 10, higher numbers being more important, how important is this particular one? So, and you can do that for any layer on Vermont Conservation Design. I've just demonstrated it with this one. We'll next check the box for physical landscape diversity blocks, and in pink you can see that we have a highest priority physical landscape diversity block on our property. And in particular, by clicking on the property, you can see that our property is special because we have representative acidic granite. And so again, if the soils in bedrock are unique to a space, they give rise to a unique and diverse form of life above the ground. And so we are one of the categories in Vermont that's trying to promote that diverse form of life above ground by conserving the soils and the geology of the place. But again, we can drill down not only into landscape layers, but we can zoom back in to our finer scales, the community and the species scale, for a perspective shift. So I've turned on overall priorities, Vermont Conservation Design, community and species scale here. And just like that first landscape slide I showed you, this is designed to give you a very basic overview of what might be on your property. And I should mention in this slide that the finer scales of Vermont Conservation Design are incomplete, which means that if you don't see anything pop up for your property, it doesn't mean that things aren't there. It just means they have not been reported to the state of Vermont yet. So one of the ways I like to use this layer is to look around in the neighborhood and see what else has been reported, and then to consider if those things that have been reported elsewhere might be on my property. And in this particular case, you can see that a rare and uncommon species has been reported right next door. So we're going to drill down a little bit into this. So by doing this, I'm going to turn on the community and species components layer, which is, again, drilling down into this finer layer. And what I like to do is check all the boxes, and then the ones that nothing shows up, I just uncheck. So in this case, I have saved these two because something showed up. And the first is this uncommon species. And by clicking on it, just as with any other layer, you can pull up information about it. And in this case, you can see that the rare and uncommon species was last observed in 2006, that it is an S2 or S3, which means it's somewhere between rare and uncommon in Vermont, and that it is an invertebrate animal. So if I were the owner of this property, I might start stroking my chin and thinking like, oh, can I bring my neighbor some cookies? I'd really like to know what that thing is that's on their property or was reported there, because maybe it's on my property too and no one has found it because we haven't looked. And so I think it's always worth thinking about what's around me and could it be on my property? And the answer is it might be, because there's a lot at this layer that is incomplete. The other thing I just wanted to show you quickly is that this landowner has riparian wildlife road crossings and actually terrestrial ones on the south end of their property. So if I were this landowner and I was really interested in promoting wildlife movement, I might actually take a walk down to those places. And for animals like amphibians, I might look to see if the culverts are in good repair, if they're passable. And for things like a black bear or a moose, I might actually look and see, you know, is there any forest cover? Is this a place that animals are going to feel really uncomfortable crossing? And if I were interested in promoting animals crossing there, I might plant some trees. And if I wasn't interested in animals crossing there, I might plant trees in another place to try to promote their use of that place instead. So BioFinder has a lot of really neat functions besides the functions that I have shared with you this evening. And I encourage you to get on and play around with it. I'm only going to mention one, but I think it's a really cool one. If you click on Tools, it will bring up the Map Tools tab, and you can share, export, or print your maps. So in the case of this particular property, I might actually send a map or print and bring a map over to my neighbor along with those cookies, so that they were also interested in that thing that was on their property, because maybe they recently bought that property and they didn't realize that there was something found there in 2006. And then maybe the most important thing about this is, wow, this is a lot of information. How do I actually put this together to make management decisions for my property if I'm a landowner, or if I'm not, for a property I care about? How do I influence the decision making for that space? And so as we've talked about, some of these features as the landowner, I could probably manage more or less on my own. For example, the highest priority surface waters, I can manage that stream on my property, knowing that I'm at the head of a stream. And when that stream leaves my property, it's going downstream in good condition for everyone else. And I might be able to manage those wildlife road crossings on my property to promote wildlife use, or perhaps to redirect it. And I might also be able to look for that uncommon species and to see if it's on my property. I might be able to make choices about where I put a house if I'm going to build another house that avoid forest fragmentation and probably reduce the cost of building a road for me. But when it comes to wanting to see forest animals or promoting forest use overall, we have to start to look beyond the property boundaries, because we know that although we can influence the outcome of that place, we're not the only ones who can do it, and we cannot do it alone. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't zoom out, as Vermont Conservation Design often reminds us to do. So in this particular property, you can now see that they are just north of a fairly major road in Chester, Vermont, and that animals that are crossing north-south from that road through the property really don't have a lot of space to do that. And so as this particular landowner, I might start thinking, gosh, you know, maybe my priority is going to be to keep that forest intact, because I provide a pretty thin corridor for local and regional animal movement. And at the state level, if we zoom all the way out and we compare it with this map here, we can see that this particular property is on the climate change byway that leads from southeastern Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire up to the Green Mountains. And you can see it's actually a pretty thin corridor. And so at the state level, this property really matters, but it matters in a very different way than it does at the local level. So there are a few things to keep in mind about BioFinder. I hope I've made you excited to get on and use it. The first thing to keep in mind is that BioFinder, like any other technology, is not always perfect. It might load slowly, especially if you have a slower internet connection, and you may need to refresh your screen. I have heard that it will crash when there are hundreds of people on it at one time. So if it's not working, put it away and try again later. Importantly, as I've mentioned, the data, especially at the local level, is often incomplete. And so the maps will be updated as the data changes. So keep checking back in, or maybe if you have something on your property and you feel like reporting it, you too can add to BioFinder. So that's this point right here. If you don't see anything, don't assume it's not there. I went out in 2018 with a number of Coverts cooperators on their property, and I found something pretty amazing or special or unique on almost every property that wasn't on BioFinder. So just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't matter or that it can't be found. And finally, and I think this is the most important point, Vermont Conservation Design is really one lens for understanding and making choices about a property or a location. And it's meant to be paired with other tools. It should not replace your on-the-ground knowledge about your land. For example, at the 10,000-foot view, BioFinder can't really distinguish between a forest in excellent condition and a forest in poor condition. So your knowledge is really important. And just because you see it on Vermont Conservation Design, it doesn't mean that it's the only thing you should use to make decisions. I think at this point, I'm going to pause. And Lisa, if we have anyone who has really pressing questions, we could take 2 or 3 of them, and then we will set up for the interactive portion of the presentation.
You're good to go on. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box at the moment. So I think let's try the property challenge and see what kind of questions that might generate.
Okay, great. So to give everyone a preface to the property challenge, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to a property. The property itself is real, but I have made up all of the details for this particular exercise. And so I'm first going to give you some of the land details about what the owners of this property are interested in. And then I'm going to show you maps of the property at the state, regional, and local scale. So we're going to zoom in. And then once we have zoomed in, I'm going to open it up for questions, and I will put those maps back up on the screen. So if it feels like I'm going through these first slides a little bit quickly, don't worry, they will come back and I will have the questions as well as the maps on the screen. So here is your property challenge. James and Lucy King own 92 acres. They are enrolled in current use and they have a forest management plan. They really love wildlife and they would really like to promote moose and black bear using their property. They also like to garden and they want to put a veggie garden in somewhere on their land. One of their children also wants to build a new home on the property. And so they're wondering from a Vermont Conservation Design perspective, where should they consider building? Remembering that this is one lens of many that you can use as a tool. And finally, they would like to know what role their property plays at the local, regional, and state levels, and what would the landscape impact be if someday they had to sell the property and it were to be turned into a housing development. So these are the details, and now I'm going to show you, starting at the 10,000-foot view, what the property is. So James and Lucy King's property is here, and at the state level, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can kind of pick out that they're located in the central eastern part of Vermont, and that green blob to their south and east is a highest priority interior forest block, and it looks like they're on the edge of a white area, and there's also some purple, so that is the physical landscape diversity blocks, so those are the soils and bedrock that are unique, that give rise to diverse forms of life. And on a traditional map, this is where they're located, right near Bethel, Vermont. If we zoom in a little more to the regional layer, now you can see that they are definitely right on the edge of that highest priority interior forest block and also well in the physical diversity block. So they may have some pretty interesting soils and bedrock in their area. And you can see that they're located near a river and that there are white spaces on the map near them, as well as highest priority and priority design targets. And on a traditional map, here they are. We can now see they live in Royalton and not in Bethel. And finally, here's the local layer. So over here on the left side of the screen, you can see their property boundaries hashed in kind of a black gray. And now you can firmly see that part of their property is highest priority physical landscape diversity block. So that's the part that is the unique soils and geology that are very important to the state. They also have on the south side of the property in red wildlife road crossings. On the eastern side of the property, they have a white space, which means it's not identified as a highest priority target in the design. And pink here is riparian corridors. So this is where animals are preferentially moving along waterways. And then the blue behind it, they're really two overlapping layers, but this is rivers, ponds, streams, etc., including the floodable zones. And then finally, I'll just mention, it looks like on the northeastern part of their property, they do have a small wetland. So with that in mind, we're going to start at the local level. And what I'm hoping to do is to have people raise their hands. You don't have to go in order. I'd just love to hear your thoughts, and hopefully this can become a dialogue between people about, for these particular landowners, what can they do in terms of promoting wildlife on their property? Where should they put their veggie garden in? Where should they consider building a house? And what role does their property play at the local level? And how would subdivision impact it? And if you're really excited to get to the regional and state level, we will go there in a few minutes. So raise your hand if you have something to share. Lisa will call on you and you can unmute yourself. And we'll probably take 3 or 4 thoughts at least for each section of slide, or more if people are really excited.
And don't be shy.
Yes, and feel free to take a moment to look at the map, or if you need to ask any clarifying questions, I am happy to help.
While we're waiting for people to kind of put their thoughts together, a question that came into the chat box is, how do they report something if they found something they think is unique or important on their property? How do they report that or add it to BioFinder?
Yeah, that's a great question. You have to email it to Fish and Wildlife, the Fish and Wildlife Department. And so typically what happens is if you have a forest management plan and a forester, they may tell you that they found something and ask you if you would like to report it. So that's the most typical way. You could, as a private landowner, directly email the state, and they might want to come out and confirm that the thing that you found is the thing that they're excited about. But because there are perhaps limited people who are used to reporting, that is part of the reason that that layer is incomplete.
Great. Tim wants to know, are they solely looking at the cross-hatched area to answer these questions?
Yes, so you can look anywhere on the map, but just keep in mind that the cross-hatched area is the property in question. But as we've discussed, some actions the landowners might be able to take on their own land. Other actions, they might want to visit their neighbors and bring cookies if they are interested in these goals.
Carolyn and her cookies, which by the way, I've had and are very good.
I should mention there are multiple ways to think about this, and there are multiple right answers. And so I would encourage you, if you're willing, to raise your hand or to chat that you have something to say, and to throw it out there, because this again is a dialogue.
So Rachel, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question or your point?
Okay, so look, just considering question number 1 about moose and black bear, since the whole southern boundary of the property is along this this wildlife crossing, it seems like exploring that corridor or that property boundary and seeing what, you know, what condition it's in, what kind of things are happening with it. There's some water, you know, maybe tree planting or removing something, like if there's some white spaces around the water, maybe if there's something that was formerly built, an old trailer or something there, to make that area more desirable for stopping along the way.
That's a great point. I love that suggestion. Does anyone want to add to that or throw out something different?
So Jeff, would you like to add something in there?
So it would seem to me that if you're going to build a house or do a development in the future, it would seem that the white area is the only area you'd want to consider. Is that true?
Yeah, I would say from a Vermont Conservation Design perspective, it certainly is one of the best candidates. Of course, you might have on the ground knowledge about a property, and there might be a reason that you would consider building somewhere else, but I think it's certainly a good candidate.
Tim, would you like to jump in with your observation?
Yeah, and I excuse my comments, but I was just thinking as they consider building a new house and just examining their riparian zone, which they seem to have a fairly extensive area for that, and then ensuring that they've tackled their invasives throughout and have a treatment plan, but those don't necessarily tie back to building a new house. So I'm a little off the mark.
That's okay. All comments are welcome. I'm really hoping this can be a place where people can voice their thoughts.
Trevor, would you like to talk about the vegetable garden?
Oh, I found out from experience that it's always better to put it near the house to keep the animals away. And of course, the white hatched area doesn't have the ecological values, and so you know, that's where you put the kids' house, probably near there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it's a good reminder that there might be multiple reasons to put something somewhere. So from a VCD perspective, it might make sense, but also it just might make sense because you don't want to try to keep deer out of the garden. So great point.
Amen.
Does anyone have any comments? You're welcome to just take a shot at it. What do you think from an ecological perspective, what role does this property play in the local neighborhood? And what would be the impact if this area was developed for housing in terms of the ecology of the land, besides the immediate you know, paving over of certain locations?
To me, one of the unique aspects of it is the amount of area that is connected to the river or water body there, and limiting any potential damage to that river and staying as far back as possible from it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And we don't necessarily get a sense, because I didn't turn on the satellite view of this property, we don't get a sense of what that white is. But if it's an agricultural field, maybe it would be great to put in a buffer so that when it rains, water runs off, it goes through the buffer and the water is cleaned before it goes to the stream.
That's great, and that addresses Rachel's comment. She said she was concerned about the wetland, but it's still in the white area. So that really addresses that concept of having that land-based knowledge as well. I love that you've described VCD as just a tool in the toolbox.
Yes, it's one tool. And if this were your land, I might go over to that wetland and I might see how it's doing. And if it really is in the full sun, as it probably is, right? We're not seeing any forest cover around it on the map. I might plant some willows, and they're actually pretty easy to plant. You just cut them off the base and stick them in the ground, and that would immediately lower the water temperature. It would decrease the amount of water evaporating out of that wetland and maybe make it a more habitable place for a lot of species. Lisa, maybe we can take one or two more comments and then we'll start to zoom out to the regional level.
Sure. Trevor noted that the purple area would provide coverts or habitats for birds and mammals.
Mm-hmm.
Tim had a question. Tim, do you want to ask your question?
Now I've lost it in the line here, but do you have it right in front of you?
My question was,
Tim McKay.
My apologies.
My question was about floodplain. Presumably that white area may very well be a floodplain, which would affect all the things we're talking about. And how are soils factored into the analysis of these blocks?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to the first point, is this a floodplain? The answer is there is a layer in BioFinder that you can turn on that is contours. So you could see the rise of the land and basically figure out whether that area was likely to flood. And I think it's a really valid point, right? We're right next to a stream, so it's very possible. And that would, of course, impact where you might want to build a house, for example. And then the physical landscape diversity blocks, how are soils included? I'll do my best to give you a simple answer. The more in-depth answer is that we had a team, well, I shouldn't say we, Vermont Fish and Wildlife, the Vermont Land Trust, FPR, the state of Vermont, and a bunch of other partners basically got together and they said, we're going to do a detailed analysis. And for the physical landscape diversity blocks, they specifically said, let's identify all of the different soils and geologies in Vermont, which is a pretty big task. And then let's figure out which of them are likely to be developed in a way that we'll never get them back and we don't have a lot of that landscape. And then let's also figure out what are the geologies and the soils that make Vermont unique, that it's our responsibility to steward because we have them, but a lot of other places in the Northeast don't. And so then they basically went through all those soil and bedrock layers and they ranked them, and then they overlaid the rankings, and the things that came out on top show up as physical landscape diversity blocks. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to the question, and it's actually quite a bit more detailed than that, but that's the basic idea, that they tried to figure out what was rare, what was representative, and then what do we need to conserve or steward in order to make sure that we have all of those different types of soils and bedrock to give rise to diverse forms of life.
Great. Anna, there's two comments I want to get through. Anne noted, what about putting the land into a conservation easement to prevent future development?
Yes, I mean, that is one great option. I will say that conserving land, while it's an amazing option, is not an option that everyone wants or can do because it's often expensive to conserve land. And so in the case of this particular landowner, they might say, wow, you know, we really want to conserve some of the land, but not all of it. Maybe they need to have a little bit of financial security and they need to know they can sell some land if they need to, or maybe it's simply too expensive. And so I would say that it is one, just like Vermont Conservation Design is a tool, a land easement is a tool, and it's a great tool, but it's not necessarily the only tool.
All right, and Jessica, had a question because you said this land was under UVA. Wouldn't the UVA plan cover where buildings could be built or where a vegetable garden could be placed? I would assume it'd have to be in your excluded portion. So
yes, that's a really fabulous point. Yes, so typically you would have to exclude a place you were going to build a house or put in a garden. The only thing I'll say is that UVA has a lower limit of 27 acres, and since we know this particular parcel is 92 acres, they could choose probably to exclude a fair chunk of it and still be eligible for UVA, but that's a very good point.
Great. Rachel wanted to know, does terrain or altitude factor in physical landscape diversity blocks?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. So the short answer is that it does factor in because it actually affects the way that soils form, and it oftentimes affects whether bedrock is even exposed. So for example, the Champlain Valley used to be under a large lake, and so the soils are 60 feet deep in some places, whereas obviously on the top of Mount Mansfield or Camel's Hump, they're exposed. And so through their unique presence on the landscape, elevation is factored in.
And then Trevor noted, could BioFinder be used to amend a UVA management plan? And I would say not amend it, but just give you more information as you're working through it and developing it.
Yeah, and I think many foresters across Vermont are actually now starting to include Vermont Conservation Design maps in their forest management plan. And so it is a great tool in my perspective. And when you pair it with on the ground knowledge, which you, I'm sure, would have about your own property, and your forester would also provide through a forestry lens, together they're great tools. So if you have a forest management plan and a forester, you can ask them, if they haven't already, to include these kinds of maps in your forest management plan. But I would also say you don't have to wait for a forester. This tool is accessible to anyone, and they're going to be using it pretty much the same way I just demonstrated demonstrated to you this evening. So if you want, you can open up the recorded version of this presentation and you can go step by step through your own property on BioFinder with me via the recording.
That sounds great. All right, is there another slide or another
Yes,
way to look at this property?
We're gonna zoom out. Thank you for the awesome discussion. Okay, so we're gonna look at some of the same questions and maybe some different ones at the regional level, and maybe we'll just take 2 or 3 comments in the interest of time. But you can see here that zooming out, they're squarely in that physical landscape diversity block on the edge of a major interior forest block, and then there's some white around them. So what could they do to promote wildlife at this scale, and what role does their property play in their region?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'll speak up. It looks like the west and eastern portions on this map have a pretty kind of thin connector, like you were talking about with the other property. So maybe having this subdivided would make it even harder for wildlife to pass from west to east here.
That's an awesome point.
Rachel Cohen, would you like to jump in with your comment?
Yeah, maybe I'm just not very practiced at looking at a map at this particular scale. But that purple area looks pretty big in relation to the size of the property we were looking at the other scale.
Mm-hmm.
How many parcels or how many landowners, how many different towns is that in?
Yeah.
Is there any kind of regional, what do we mean by region? Is it, if it's all within one town, maybe the Conservation Commission is the place to go for this landowner to interact with other people. But if it's on the border of South Royalton and Bethel or something like that, then maybe there has to be some larger scale, countywide, or bringing a county forester or somebody to get the conversation among those landowners established, especially because if it's really hilly, the road might not go through the same place as the biological or physical diversity patch. It doesn't necessarily define the boundaries of the natural communities.
Yes, that's a really great point, and I agree. And one of the wonderful things, and maybe also frustrating things about Vermont Conservation Design, is that you can really zoom in and out to any scale depending on what your objectives are. So you're absolutely right that they might need to work with Bethel as well as with South Royalton folks if they're really interested in stewarding the larger portion of their surrounding landscape. Whereas if they're only worried about their immediate neighbors, maybe they can keep it in South Royalton only.
Also, this is a very broad question, but with the physical diversity blocks, what constitutes conservation of that besides like soil erosion or something like that? I mean, you don't do anything about the bedrock.
Right, that's an extremely awesome question. And essentially, well, erosion, as you already mentioned, is one of the things you can do, particularly with regards to conserving soil. But outside of that, it's an easy and a hard target, because really what it's saying is, let's not pave over these particular soils. We want to conserve their ability to give rise to life. So for example, in the Champlain Valley, we have a fair number of landscape diversity blocks that are all agricultural. And from the soils and bedrock perspective, that's absolutely fine, as long as we are making sure that those soils and their bedrock are being conserved. Bedrock's usually not a big worry unless you're quite literally paving over it. But of course, there are things that affect soil health. And so that's perhaps more of a concern with something like agriculture. But it illustrates a really great example that there's a lot of things you can do with land and still steward it from the perspective of Vermont Conservation Design. Great. Just in the interest of time, Lisa, are there any more pressing questions, or should we move on to the state level?
Let's move on to the state level.
Okay. So here's our last map. I'm so appreciative of all the great discussion we've had so far. So here are some of the questions that might be relevant at the state level. And on the right, just for your reference, I've put that climate change corridor map in, showing how animals and maybe even plants under climate change scenarios might be moving through the state or moving up in elevation. So any thoughts on some ways that James and Lucy can impact things via their property at the state level? I'll also mention briefly while you're thinking that on the right, these orange lines are major routes, and then these little dark orange lines are regional routes. So if this is Highway 89, this is more like Route 7 or some of the other major local roads.
Carolyn, can you put your cursor where the James and Lucy King's property is on that map?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So hold on, I have to find my cursor. Here we go. So their property is roughly here, where the tip of that pointer is. Whoops, or where it was until it disappeared. I'll put it back there. So it's right here at the southern end of this area.
So Tim notes, keep as much of the land intact without further subdivisions to maintain the wildlife corridor and that connectivity.
Excellent. That's a great point, especially given their location along that squiggly orange route. Any other thoughts or comments?
Carolyn, I'm going to ask you a quick question. What if my beloved property falls in a white area? Is it not important?
That's a great question. The short answer is, just because your property is in a white area, it doesn't mean it's not important. And there's a few things to consider here. One thing is perspective, right? Zooming out and zooming in. Vermont Conservation Design is a state level vision, and it's trying to ask the question at the state level, if we can't conserve or steward it all, what should we be really concerned about? It doesn't mean that good stewardship on lands that are not highest priority won't help Vermont be a more ecologically functional place to live. And again, when you zoom in, there are a lot of things at the local layer that have not been mapped that may actually be on your particular property. I should also mention, since Lisa asked the question, that Vermont Conservation Design is a biological model. That means it's not asking, where do people recreate? Where do people go to get outdoors? Where do people like to get together and garden? So there are a lot of other factors besides the biology of a place that might make it really, truly special. And Vermont Conservation Design will never pick up your favorite place to sit under a big tree as a child, but it's a really special place regardless. And so I would just say that this vision is designed to say, if we can't save it all, where should we save first? And that doesn't mean that saving other places are not important too. And remember, you don't have to conserve it formally in order to be a good steward.
Margaret wants to know, is there a VCD target for percent state conserved or percent state forested? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like the right person to ask, because I actually led a study on this last year. And the study asked, how much of Vermont is a target at the state level and how far are we? And the short answer is that about 2/3, 66% of Vermont is a target of some kind. And we have conserved, quote unquote, through protected lands, about 1/3 of it. And that does not even account for all of the wonderful stewardship that is happening on private lands. So perhaps the best way to state this is we have a long way to go, but we have come really far. And I think it's a doable goal, to be quite honest.
Great. Jeff asked a question a little ways back. He said he noticed that the ortho photos are different than Google Maps and the ANR Atlas. And he was wondering what the date of the ortho photos are.
Oh, that's a great question. So you can actually, when you go into BioFinder, you can click on the ortho photo and it should pull up a date for you. And there's actually multiple ortho photos to choose from. So I can't tell you off the top of my head what the ortho photo date on that particular photo is, but you have multiple options and you can actually change which one displays.
Great. Going back to the percentage question, he said 1/3 of the 2/3 is where we're at.
Yes, 1/3 of the 2/3 is where we're at. Great clarifying point.
So a great question is right now from Tim. What would you suggest individual landowners do with BioFinder following this presentation?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. I feel like you really just set me up there. I would say if you own land, or if you don't, but there's land you care about that you want to be involved in, then get on BioFinder, look at your property using the BioFinder lens, and see what pops up. You can start to figure out, you know, is my property part of a really big forest block? Because that might change the way you think about management, or if you're going to subdivide or develop, it might change how you think about that. I would say also, oftentimes BioFinder will tell you things that you kind of sort of already knew. Like, you obviously may know if you have a stream on your property, but what it will do is it will shift your perspective by highlighting how important those things that you already knew you had really are at different scales. So I would say if you're a little nervous about BioFinder, one of the resources that Lisa is going to send out is step-by-step instructions if you prefer to read them. Or again, you can access the recorded link of this presentation and you can type in your own address and follow me through the presentation at those different layers for the place you live or the place you love.
Great, and I will be sending that out along with a survey probably tomorrow morning.
Yes.
Just a quick question. So it gets a little confusing, right? We said Vermont Conservation Design, and then suddenly we're talking about BioFinders. So BioFinder is the tool to use the tool of Vermont Conservation Design and its data layers. Can you clarify that just a little bit for everyone?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. It is confusing. So Vermont Conservation Design is the vision, which is essentially the map that, based on science and expert advice, we think we need in order to make Vermont a good place for all forms of life into the future, including under climate change and development patterns. And BioFinder is just a way to view the maps that have already been put together. And so BioFinder is just a way to look at the information that we already have about some of these most important things in the state. It doesn't mean that BioFinder is necessarily going to always be the only tool for it, but what's nice about it is it's an interactive way to look at what science and expert advice is showing us in terms of things that we really need to conserve or steward in order to keep Vermont a good place to live.
Well, I think that's an excellent place for us to end. It's now just 8 o'clock, so we'll let you all get on with your evening. Thank you, Carolyn, so much for this presentation and explaining this tonight. Do you have a few things to share with us?
Yeah, I just wanted to put up some screenshots. These are the resources that Lisa is going to be sending out. 2 of them are mine. One of them shows you step-by-step how to go through BioFinder and do what we just did. The one in the middle is the same thing. The state put it together, and so I thought it would be nice to have 2 versions because maybe one will work better for you. And then on the right is, okay, I got on BioFinder, I saw my property, now what? And if you forget everything we talked about tonight, it's a really nice way to remind yourself what are your actions potentially that you could take as a landowner if you're interested in using Vermont Conservation Design to look at your property, and what could you maybe think about doing? And Lisa, since we're at the presentation end, I'll just end with this wonderful photo. This is Lisa and a couple of Coverts cooperators that I went out with in 2018 because we were looking at land on the ground as well as through the lens of Vermont Conservation Design. On the left is my email address for presentation questions. And I've also included the address of Andy Wood, who works for Fish and Wildlife. And he is actually doing this now as a full-time job. So if you have presentation questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. And if you want to know how you can learn more about the design outside of this presentation, or you want a fish and wildlife biologist to come walk your property with you, Andy is the one to get in touch with.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those wonderful resources, and we'll be emailing out those other resources that you showed on the screen. Vermont Coverts has been thrilled to bring this all to you this evening, and we hope that you'll continue to come onto our Zoom programs. If you are not already signed up for our e-news, please do so, and that will alert you to our program and the partners programs that we think that would be great for you to be on as well. So thank you again for a wonderful evening. I hope you all get outside and get out and see Neowise tonight. That has been so fun to see. Another way to enjoy our wonderful outdoors. And I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you all.